Please join We Charge Colonialism for our very first live stream program, Why Black Organizations Struggle. We will be having a panel discussion where we try to figure out why is it that attempts at Black liberation have not succeeded in the past, and what can we learn from our ancestors and our freedom fighters about how we should move the fight forward. Again, the broadcast will be on July 25th at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, and you can go to our YouTube, We Charge Colonialism, and subscribe.
There are many of our people who are thinking more deeply and more broadly, looking at it as it actually is, and are beginning to see it more in the international context and the relation that it has with the African struggle, a human rights struggle, or the struggle for human rights. And as such, we can then take it into the United Nations.
To bring about the freedom of these people by any means necessary.
Hi family, and welcome to We Charge Colonialism. We Charge Colonialism. We are an organization of Black Pan-Africanists who are seeking recognition that Africans in the United States are being colonized by the United States government. Colonization is not something that is unique to Africa or to Latin America, but that is something that the United States has also practiced within its own borders. So what I want to talk about today, we announced a few weeks ago that we really wanted to pursue an initiative to actually get recognition of Africans in the United States inside of the African Union. There have been some other organizations in the past that have actually done that. Some organizations of Africans in America that have gotten observer status inside of the African Union. While observer status is obviously a step, we would even go far as to say that we want full membership, for the purpose of solidarity, international solidarity, and also having a backup whenever we are dealing with issues of racism, whenever we are dealing with issues of police violence, when we're dealing with issues of discrimination. We need an outside arbitrator to put pressure on the government to do right by people who have been the ones who actually built this country. We've seen what happened with George Floyd's family. They made an appeal to the United Nations to have a discussion about police violence in relation to George Floyd, and to try to bring about some type of changes from an international standpoint. And what we've seen is that the African Union all went around George Floyd's family and they said, we're going to support this initiative. So, they had basically every single African country supported the debate on the United Nations floor, and that actually actualized into something. So imagine, how far this can go. Imagine what it would be like if every single incident of abuse, of prejudice, of violence committed against African people in the United States, if there was a very real presence and a understanding that we're not alone in this, that we're not isolated, that we're not cut off, that we don't have allies. Having allies is a very important thing. Not just allies in the government, but allies outside of your government is a very important thing to have whenever you're seeking to make the case that you are a person and that your rights should be respected. So, I wanted to talk about today the African Union, and it gives people more of an understanding of how that institution could possibly play into not just freedom of Africans in the United States, but also on the continent, because we know that we are colonized everywhere. There's no place where we are free. We know that on the African continent that they may be free from colonization in a literal sense, meaning the documents might say that they're independent and say that they are not colonized, but in reality, we know that the economies of these countries are controlled by outside, typically European powers or the United States, or also more and more we see the economies being controlled by Asian influence, so China, for example. So we know that although technically they're free, that they're not really free, because if you don't control your economy, if you don't control your politicians, if you have people who are outside of your jurisdiction calling the shots, controlling your politicians, giving them money behind the scenes, and that being the motivating force for them in taking certain actions. If that's the case, then we know that your country is not independent. Your country is still colonized, and neocolonialism is just as effective as colonialism. As we see, look at the thing that you're looking at me on. More than likely, you're watching me on a computer or a laptop, an iPad, or a cell phone. Those all those things, they were the materials inside of those products were taken from the Congo, more than likely, and they were taken because the people who have the power in the situation are the people who are outside of those countries. And so the actual country of the Congo is one of the poorest countries in the world, they say, as far as how the population is living. But as far as the mineral wealth in the Congo, it's actually one of the richest countries. It actually is the richest country, I'm sorry, in the whole world. So how do you make sense of that? How do you make sense of the fact that you're supposed to not be colonized, but you don't have control over your own resources? If clearly they don't have control over their own resources, otherwise you'd have Apple not getting these products so cheaply. You'd have Toshiba or Dell or whatever other companies. You have all these car manufacturers, weapons manufacturers having to pay the actual value of the product instead of getting these things cheaply because they were cheaply mined by children for the purpose of enriching Western powers. So clearly something is wrong. Clearly something isn't right. Clearly something is broken. And of course, we're the ones on the end of receiving the negative effects of those things being broken. So what I would like to do, just for people to understand a little better, is paint the picture of how the African Union can actualize change. So to understand the African Union, you obviously have to understand the Organization of African Unity. If you're in the U.S., you might know that Malcolm X, he had founded an organization called the Organization of Afro-American Unity. This organization was actually based on the Organization of African Unity, which was an organization of different states inside of Africa, all the African states that were recently free from colonialism, most of them at the time at least. They came together and they said, we're going to have a big group. We're going to have an organization where we can all come together and we can basically fight colonialism together. Now, it's important to understand, while you see this as being a great thing, right? Because you had all these groups coming together saying, we're going to fight colonialism together. Well, they didn't necessarily have the same aims. In fact, a lot of those nations, African nations, were still colonized. They still were very close to their Western colonizers. They were still very much under the colonial influence. And so where you had people saying, come on, let's come together and find a way to come together and fight colonialism, clearly others had different motivations. So this is a thing that happens inside of every single Black freedom struggle, and this was one of the freedom struggles where this occurred. So again, they came together, said we're gonna try to find a way to bring together African unity, to effectuate Pan-Africanism, the idea that all of us, we're all inside of this fight together, the idea that all of us, our freedom is interlinked with one another. So when they did that, there was basically a split among the group. Many of you should know Kwame Nkrumah. He was the first president of Ghana, and he also was the kind of like the leader of the free, not just Free Africa movement, but the Uniting Africa movement. Kwame Nkrumah, whenever they were talking about this organization that they were going to create, this institution they were going to create between African states, he wanted an organization that was completely united, meaning not just a different separate states and, you know, we come together and we make proclamations like, hey guys, you should do this, hey guys, you should do that, but we actually don't have the power to enforce those things. Kwame Nkrumah wanted it to actually be like a federation meaning kind of like the United States of America. You know, there's individual states which obviously have their own powers, but the federal government, those states, they fall under the federal government. And so he wanted the Organization of African Unity to actually be a government, one Africa. Africa would be together. That was his vision, and he led a group called the Casablanca Group. Now the other group, the Monrovia Group, basically was like, no, we don't want that. We want to have our independent states. We do want to, you know, support a unity, but we don't want the type of unity where we all fall under one government. We want to have our own independence. Now, a few things to keep in mind. These are countries that were very recently decolonized, meaning they had just been under Britain, just been under Belgium, just been under, you know, different countries. France, that was a major one, obviously. So these are countries where a lot of them were still, in fact, all of them were still very much under the influence of their colonizers. So what was of a concern to Nkrumah was having all of these people who are still very much close to their colonial masters, but saying that they're independent and saying that their governments are going to be independent and that we're going to come together, but we're still going to keep our distance. The trouble with that is that if you're independent and yet you're dependent, that leads basically to a situation where you're going to have disunity, you're going to have outside infiltration, and you're not able to make a broad proclamation, for example, and say that, we're not going to take this type of thing from the West. Well, you have these countries that are still very much close to France. In fact, it's not a coincidence. A lot of the countries that were in the Monrovia group, the group that was against having a united Africa, they wanted to keep their own individual nations. A lot of them were from former Francophone countries. So a lot of them were colonized by France. And as we know, France basically has always kept the most dominant presence in Africa and with regard to its former colonies. So, when you have a situation where you have different people still very close to their masters, still very close to them, still getting advice from them, and that advice is obviously not for their benefit, but it's for the colonists' benefit, but they're still getting advice, they're still getting feedback, they're still, hearing from them, this is what we think what you should do, and this is what we're going to give you some money to actually effectuate. When you still have people in different places that are getting that type of influence, it just leads to a situation where it's not going to be real, true African unity. It's going to be unity for the purposes of effectuating European colonialism. And that's what Nkrumah wanted to rid Africa of. Unfortunately, again, a lot of people did not follow suit. And essentially, when you have the creation of the Organization of African Unity, it really was a reflection of what the Monrovia group wanted. Everyone still had their own independent nations. Instead, what you had was kind of like a symbolic unity. We're going to come together, we're going to discuss issues. But as we have seen this happen in many times in international politics, having that type of situation is not going to affect change. The United Nations, for example, is not in a position to actually affect change. However, the European Union is in a more of a situation where they can affect change because they all had a current currency. They didn't have borders. If you were a citizen of this European Union country, you could easily go to this one. Decisions were made in unison. That's essentially why Britain decided that they wanted to leave the European Union, because they felt like their sovereignty was taken away by this entity. And that's the situation that has worked for them for a long time. Now, I say this to say that when we see the African Union today, and again, the Organization of African Unity, it became the Organization of the African Union. That's what they named it. A lot feel like they changed the name from the Organization of African Unity to the African Union because of the European Union. They wanted to basically mirror what was going on in Europe. But what's important to note is that even though they changed the name, the actual setup, the structure remained the same. These were still independent African countries. They still were having their own independent decisions going on, and there wasn't a commonality. And that's really where the situation leads us to today. When we say we want membership, not just observer status, although, I believe everything's a step towards the right direction. But when we say we want membership, we're not saying that we want membership, for the purposes of us just sitting back and watching. We also want to take a part in the liberation movements in Africa. And an important liberation movement that needs to happen is the organization, the African Union, really needs to go back and reevaluate their setup and reevaluate what Nkrumah was advocating versus what others have advocated, versus what the Monrovia group called for. Because what we see is that what the Monrovia group wanted has not worked. And what we can also see is that what Nkrumah was calling for has worked for others. Again, Europe has been very effective with their European Union. And I think there's no better time than now to see that type of discourse, because if you notice, a lot more recently, you're starting to hear on the African continent, people are starting to say, you know what, we really shouldn't have these borders enforced. Number one, these borders were they weren't drawn by Africans, they were drawn by colonists. The colonists literally took a pencil and said, all right, here, France, you can have this. No regard for who they were drawing over, meaning like they completely divided nations, they completely divided people, tribes, and there was no regard for that. It was just, all right, I'm gonna draw like this. Here, you can have this. Oh, okay, you want this? Oh, you can have that. Those are the borders that exist today. So when we understand that, it becomes a real problem, because number one, these borders have caused a lot of conflict, as you can imagine. I mean, could you imagine if someone, you see how stubborn Texas is right now. Could you imagine if someone just took a pencil and just drew it right through Texas and said, all right, this part's going to be this part, this part's going to be that part. You're going to be East Texas, you're going to be West Texas, and that's what it's going to be. You're going to see a lot of conflict. You're going to see a lot of family separation. You're going to see a lot of people who are angry, and it's just going to cause a lot of destability. That's what happened in Africa. That's what still is happening in Africa. But more and more people are starting to say, these borders, they're really not serving our interests. Maybe we should reconsider them. Maybe we should think back again about maybe creating something that's more reflective of us as a people. And this is important, because we have to get to the situation where we're actually going into that African unity direction, and away from this idea that we could be separate and still effectuate change. The other thing we have to understand is the problem with unity, as we talk about it today, is that if we're separate, then there's always someone who could easily get co-opted. But if Africa was together, meaning, unified, a federation instead of these separate states that are going in this direction, going in that direction, it would be a lot more difficult for France, for example, to say, okay, we're going to try to do this, pay this money to this leader and, take control of this. It would be a lot more difficult because everyone's centralized. It's not easy to pick one off of the flock. You have to essentially go out against the whole government. Another thing that Kwame Nkrumah wanted with this African Federation is he also wanted there to be a Pan-Africanist army, meaning like instead of all these separate African armies, let's have one Pan-Africanist army all under this organization of African unity, or under whatever organization you want to call it. Imagine what that would mean. When you think about how the armies work now, you have these people that are getting money from the U.S., you got these people that are getting money from France, you got these people that are getting money from Russia, and what is that? That's all for proxy wars. But if we had one centralized army, then that would essentially mean that we're all together in this. You can't come in and say, hey, we're going to give you some money to, side with us, or give you some money to side with us. No, we are centralized and we're focused, So these are the things that we stand to benefit from in the African Union, if the African Union can take the positions that were stated and advocated for by people like Kwame Nkrumah. So what does this relate to us if you're in the U.S., and I understand not everyone who watches us are necessarily in the U.S., but if you're in the U.S. and you're trying to understand this idea of getting observer status, how does this relate to us? Well, we have to struggle to essentially get to the situation where we want to be in. Not one, an independent and free Africa absolutely means an independent and free status for us who do decide to remain in America, which is not all of us, but some of us, as of now, we don't see how we could live anywhere else. But an independent Africa is absolutely essential to an independent black people in Georgia, or black people in New York, or whatever. It's absolutely essential. So we have to not just go into this just for the ceremony of it, not just to feel special, not just to feel like, hey, we're really African. Well, we are African. No one can take that away from us. But we have to go into this with the mindset that we are going into this for a revolutionary purpose. The purpose is to truly fight colonialism in the U.S. and abroad, particularly with our brothers and sisters who are of African descent. So that is what we are trying to do. That is why we want to do it. And so hopefully this brings some more understanding to people. I hope that the African Union understanding the original intention of the Organization of African Unity that Kwame Nkrumah wanted. He wanted a united Africa. I hope that you could see the benefit in that. I hope that you could see why the African Union hasn't been as effective as it could be, and hopefully we can all move forward as a collective to see the type of change that we want to be seen. I can say that people who have my interest in the United States are very few, right? If you're of African descent in the U.S., they say who knows what we are in this population, because I don't know who else fills out the Census Bureau. But, and if you haven't, fill out the Census Bureau, everyone. But, they say that we're about 13% of the population. So, if that's the case, think about it. The vast majority of people, don't make me do math, what is that? 87% of people in the United States do not share our interests. Whereas people in the African continent, the vast majority of them are African, do share our interests. So it's something else to fight for recognition in something that is actually built supposedly for your interest versus fighting for recognition in something that isn't. So that is all we have for this video. We'd like to hear your comments. If you're interested in joining WCC, please send us an email, or you can also go to our website. We have a membership application, wechargecolonialism.org. I will see you guys in the next video. The Justice Bank. So what is the Justice Bank? I've talked before about the fact that we were trying to do a bail project, but we ended up deciding to do a mutual aid fund. The Justice Bank initiative will essentially take members, and if you would pay a very low monthly membership fee. We're going to keep it low on purpose because we are servicing a people who are the most disenfranchised in this country, the most under attack, and it's not reasonable to expect that there's that someone could pay $30 a month, $50 a month, whenever you are of that group. Now, when you become a member, we're going to have a trial period, maybe say after 3 or 6 months, whatever, you are eligible to petition us for help with your expenses. Now, what type of people who are targeted from the prison industrial complex, what type of people would be eligible? Well, because we're doing a mutual aid society, that would be democratic. What we mean is that if you are a member of the Justice Bank, you would have a say in what types of, let's say, charges or offenses that you want to be covered under the Justice Bank. The idea is that all of us are putting our money in collectively because we are a target of the prison industrial complex. Every single day that we walk out, you as a Black person, you are seen as a criminal in this country, and that is a fact. And we want to offer a type of protection for our people, and almost like an insurance policy, honestly, that if you do have some type of run-in with the law, if you do have a charge, a criminal charge, that you can count on a mutual aid society to help you and assist you with those types of charges.
Nowhere in the world incarcerates as much as we do. We've seen extremely high rates of exposure to the criminal justice system for African American men with very low levels of schooling. So if we think about Black men who were born in the late 1970s and who are growing up through the American prison boom of the 1980s and the 1990s, the chances that they're going to serve time in state or federal prison if they dropped out of high school is about 70%. So going to prison for that group of Black men with very low levels of schooling, that's become a normal life event. And that's really only happened in the last 10 years. We're at this point now where there's about 1.2 million African American children with a parent who's incarcerated. That's about 1 in 9.